Good morning. It's good to be here again. Today we are looking at John chapter 19. And, we've gone a long way through John. There's only a few more chapters. But one thing I noticed as I was getting ready was how John spent so much time on this part of Jesus' story. So we had 11 chapters talking about basically the first 3 years of his ministry. From chapter 12 through now, we've had about 1 week. Chapter 13 through now has been about 20 hours. Seems like 6 months that we've been preaching on these 20 hours. But I think that points to something that John is trying to say, that this scene in Christ's life, he really wants us to understand what's going on. So, today, that's what we want to do. We want to hear what John is saying and see what God is speaking to us through it today. So, we're going to start at verse 1. We're going to go through verse 16. I have my clicker here. It doesn't do any good if the slides aren't up. There we go. Then Pilate, that's one. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. Jumps right into it here. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away. Take him away. Crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. There's a lot there. And for people familiar with church and with this story, you've probably heard it framed in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different characters you could focus on. You could look at Jesus. You could look at Pilate, the leaders, the crowd, even the soldiers. But what stands out to me in this passage is a different character. It's only named in verses 10 or 11, but its backdrop is there throughout. And that character is power. Power. There is a lot of power dynamics going on here. So what do we mean by power? What this word, I can't read that. I did not go to seminary, but I can tell you what Sophia would say, because I'm sure she would have this word there, is exousia. It's a very interesting word. It means a power of choice, being able to do what you want, having authority. Sometimes it's translated as authority, having the right or privilege to command others. And this word is very common in the New Testament and throughout the Bible. It's over 100 times it's used. So I feel like John is trying to say something about power in this passage. And that's what I want to kind of dig at, different lens to kind of look at this story we might be familiar with. And I want to point at this reality that we experience, that sometimes power is beyond individuals. It takes on a life of its own. And I think this is an idea that is important for us because as a society, we're having a conversation about so many issues. And we're bumping into this idea, but it's kind of behind the scenes. We don't know how to name it. We don't know how to handle this idea that there are things bigger than what we see. Those powers influence the world around us. It drives people to do things they otherwise wouldn't do. And when we face these powers, I want us to think about what we can learn from Jesus' example, confronting powers here, to help us respond to the powers we face in our lives. So we'll start with a little character study. First, we have Pilate. He represents the power of Roman authority. We have the Jewish leaders. They represent the power of local Jewish, spiritual, and cultural authority. We have the crowd representing the voice of the everyday person. And we have Jesus, who represents and embodies the very power of the living God. Now, one thing that I found interesting as I was thinking about this was that each of these powers has a source. Power comes from somewhere. So let's unpack that a little bit. Sorry if it's a little small. I wanted to get it all on one slide. I think we can read it. So, Pilate. If you had walked into the room and didn't really know anybody, you would probably assume Pilate had the power, right? He was the governor. He represented the hegemonic authority in this situation. He was representing an empire that was in control. The Jewish leaders told him he was the only one that could kill people. That was in chapter 18, where they were kind of groveling a little bit. And from the outside, we would just think, whatever Pilate wants to do, he can do. Wikipedia says, it's a source. I didn't use ChatGPT for this, so I'm trying to stay un-AI on my sermons. As Roman governor, Pilate would be the head of the judicial system. He has power there. He had the power to inflict capital punishment. He was responsible for collecting tributes and taxes. You got power when you can take people's money. And for dispersing funds, including the minting of coins. He can make money. But the power that he had came from his association with Rome. The power wasn't the power of Pilate, but the power of Rome, who designated Pilate as their representative. The power wasn't his. It was Rome's. But who is Rome? Right? Where did that power come from? And you can see that the Pharisees grasped at this idea in verse 12. If you let this man go, you're not a friend of Caesar. What an interesting statement. That one gets me every time. They're saying, You don't have power to make this choice. Rome has the power, and Rome wants Jesus dead. Pilate, the governor, is being told he has no power to do what he wants. He has no exousia. It's interesting. Now, what about the Sanhedrin, the chief priests? What power do they have? Well, if we back up a little bit, it seems like if there was ever a bounded set community, first century Israel might fit that box, right? They had norms that were policed by religious leaders, and following those leaders and those norms either put you in, giving you full access to the community, connection to God, or out, which essentially meant your personhood was erased within the community. And the religious leaders were the deciders. They were the gatekeepers. They could choose who was in and who was out based on how they interpreted the law. Now, they might have claimed that their power was coming from God, but in the end, the deciders only have power when people listen to them. Did you ever meet a bully who had a little posse that would follow them around? Why do they do that? Because without the posse, there is no power. Without the pressure of many people, you're just an obnoxious voice that others will eventually shun and isolate. So the power of the gatekeepers is their ability to influence the opinions and the actions of the crowd. If they say you aren't clean if you're a leper, it only means something if the community cares. If the community embraces the leper and continues on its way, the gatekeeper loses their exousia. And so then you have Jesus. Jesus threatened everything about that scenario. He spoke with power, with authority, with exousia. His actions oozed with exousia. Think about it. When he calmed the winds and the waves, he wasn't looking for anyone else's help. He wasn't looking for the support or the moral encouragement of a crowd. He just did it. He had authority over sickness. He said, "Be well," and they were well. Authority over demons that others couldn't cast out. "Be gone," and they were gone. He had authority over death. "Come out," and they came out. He didn't need anybody to exert the power of God. And so when you contrast that to the spiritual leaders, and if you're watching the scenario and you're looking, you say, these people here tell me I have to do this. This person has power. He is eroding the power base of those spiritual leaders. He is coming directly against them, which is why they're just butting heads over and over again. He's taking their power, not by trying to manipulate the crowd, but just living out the power within himself. And so Jesus had to die. And then you have the crowd. And this is one of the really interesting things. And I was just thinking about today as we were singing together. There is something about joining together with others. One voice can sing a song, but a crowd moves us. There is a power there. And in the same way, the crowd of Jewish people standing in the courtyard there, or wherever they were, that crowd individually probably had almost no power. These were people whose lives were essentially predetermined for them in every way, right? Where you live, what you do, who you marry, your socioeconomic status. You were put into a mold and just kind of went through life, and they feel that. But when you're part of a crowd, you could submit your voice and become something powerful. To the extent where the Romans and the Jewish leaders, they're afraid. They need that power. Ultimately, it's the crowd deciding what's going on. It's fascinating. And so this crowd can be manipulated by others. It can be used. People recognize that there is a real power here. And so those desiring power fight to grab this latent power of the crowd. And so given that, I want to retell this passage with a lens of power. Now, this is just the Matt Kistler Power translation. You know, I offer this with grace and hope you receive it with the same. From verse 1, the Roman power wants to exert influence and remind the crowd that it, and not the Jewish power, is in charge. So Jesus is whipped. More than that, the Roman soldiers make Jesus into an effigy of a king. Compared to the power of Rome, a Jewish king is nothing. They degrade and they mock Jewish power. They say, if you are Jewish, the height of your power is less than a mockery to our soldiers. Roman power presents this mockery to Jewish power, to the Jewish leaders, rubbing in their faces their powerlessness. But the Jewish power isn't aligned with the power embodied by Jesus. They see that power as a threat. So they ignore the mockery and reassert their own power in front of the crowd. We are the gatekeepers, and this man has broken the rules. He must be removed from the community. They remind the crowd that Jewish power still controls community life. Roman power reconsiders. They go back, reconvene, try to negotiate with God's power. I can help you overcome this Jewish power if you follow me. God's power ignores this offer and reveals that there are bigger plans at hand than Roman versus Jewish power. The very redemptive plan of God is in process and is facing off with the structural sin that has plagued the world since the beginning of mankind. Roman power doesn't get it. What power could be greater than Rome? But Jewish power realizes their advantage and binds Roman power to its core value. There can be only one Caesar. The puppet of Roman power may want to make an alliance with God, but Rome will not allow it. In one last attempt to harness the power of the crowd, Rome presents God's power, asking the crowd to decide whether they side with the Jewish power or God's power. But it is too late, and the crowd would rather spite Rome than turn on their leaders. And the Jewish leaders, in a final stroke, offer their homage to Rome while simultaneously thumbing their nose at Rome's representative. There's a lot going on there. So what? Right? So what? I believe, wow, that is even smaller. I try. So we embrace learning and discovery. I will do better next time. Okay, so if we center our lives on God, I believe we will interact with power. We are putting ourselves on a road to come against powers in this world. What might that look like? We might be confronted by angry church power who feels threatened by the way we pursue Jesus. I've experienced that. We might be confronted by angry social movements who want full allegiance to their agenda when we may only be comfortable with a small part of what they advocate for. We might be threatened by companies or corporations who benefit from damaging our community, and they view their profit more highly than our well-being. We might be ignored by the schools our children attend because what's good for our children doesn't align with the power structures of education. No matter what aspect of life we want to see made better, no matter what area we speak, your kingdom come over. Schools, businesses, housing prices, equity, inclusion, the justice system, the prison system, the immigration system, even family dynamics. We need to address the powers which perpetuate and energize brokenness as much as we need to address the individual people who are in authority today. It's not just about naming and shaming an individual who holds a position today. We need to get to the root of the power behind them. And I think that John 19 gives us a good example of how we can use, wield, and confront power when we look at Jesus. So first, we can notice that Jesus' power is intrinsic. It's from God, and he doesn't need to seek after the power of the crowd. Second, he's not distracted by the temptation of power when it's offered to him. He sees a bigger role and mission for his life and work. I'm just blown away by Jesus here and how he handles power. My friend Kevin, we were taking a walk together, and he reminded me that Jesus was just hours away, one long evening removed from asking God to take this cup from me. Jesus was looking for a way to avoid this suffering just hours ago. He probably even hasn't slept since then. And yet here is a crowd which he could surely sway with his words and power. Here is a Roman official offering him freedom. And yet he refuses. In many ways, I see this as a parallel to the temptations of Jesus. He's being offered all the power in the world if only he'd perform a sign, take the deal, or deny God. And yet he stands, silent and secure in the source of his power. In this way, I believe we have an example when we are confronting power. We need to remember we will be tempted to turn away from our center, our purpose, for the sake of more power. We'll have opportunities to be popular, to win over the crowd, to draw their anger, their fear, and their presence into our agenda. And we will often be called to shun that power and walk a different path, fueled by the power of the Holy Spirit, which provides for us to persevere. And I believe that as a center-set community, Cornerstone is preparing itself for this reality, while also putting ourselves with a bullseye in our back to the prevailing powers of the world. We are training ourselves by weekly sitting together and working out what it means to think differently in community. We are resting in the ambiguity of what it means to neither align with one camp or another theologically. That's our blessing and our challenge. To resist the desire to just fall into the mold the world and its power wants to put us into. That liberal church, those watered down Christians, that conservative church, that anti-Bible church, that hateful church, those charismatic Christians, those cultural revisionists. Whatever label people might want to put on our community. We have a path before us which will take us through the gamut of power conflicts. But we stand. We must stand not with the intention of getting rich, of getting known, of getting big, but with the intention of remaining faithful to who God daily invites us to be. With this as our center, as our North Star, we can follow Christ's example of fearless freedom in pursuing the work set before us. And we can have hope. Hope that Christ has disarmed the powers, as Colossians 2 says. When he was nailed to the cross and rose again from the grave, he disarmed the powers facing us. He made a spectacle of them. And in Revelations, we see a world made new, where the powers are brought back into alignment. There will be power in this world, but it will worship our God. That is the hope we have, that we have the tools we need to resolutely stand, to follow Christ, even when the powers of the world stare us down. And I pray that as a people, as a community, we, like Christ, will know the source of our power. Amen.